Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. What we have here is a factual, investigative briefing on exactly how clinical psychological techniques were industrialized and literally weaponized against captive adolescents. Our focus today is purely on the facts, exactly as we found them. We're going to look at a documented lineage, tracing how methodologies that were originally developed in psychiatric research and the human potential movement were repackaged, totally stripped of their clinical safeguards, and then deployed inside troubled teen programs, specifically CEDU. Here is the exact structure of what we found in the research dossier. We'll start with the lineage of coercive persuasion, move into the anatomy of the prophet, explore Grof and the clinical roots, look at the stripping of safeguards, and finish up with the trauma and aftermath. Section 1. The lineage of coercive persuasion and its historical origins. So we begin by establishing the precise chronological flow of these behavioral modifications. Look at this timeline because it grounds us in the historical facts. This wasn't some random coincidence. It was a direct transfer of technology from one organization to the next. In 1950, L. Ron Hubbard establishes the prototype with auditing, the claim that identity could be rewritten through forced emotional discharge in a closed system. Fast forward to 1958, Charles Dederick synthesizes this with AA principles to create Synanon. He strips out the metaphysics and turns it into a group blood sport, what they called attack therapy, inside a 24/7 total community. Then in 1962, SLN provides therapeutic respectability, packaging these really intense encounters into the language of human potential. And finally, in 1967, Mel Wasserman, who had actually lived at Synanon, found CEDU. Wasserman explicitly stated that CEDU was, quote, Synanon for adolescents. The foundational premise remained exactly identical: rewrite the identity through forced emotional discharge. Now, this brilliantly illustrates how CEDU converged two parallel streams of technology. On one side of the equation, you have the Synanon community model. That's a 24/7 total environment dictating daily life. We're talking hierarchy, work crews, constant public confrontation. On the flip side, you have the large group awareness training, or LGAT format. Think programs like EST and LifeSpring, which used locked rooms, sleep deprivation, verbal assault, and sudden reframes into love and unity. CEDU basically combined the day-to-day control of Synanon with the proprietary intensive breakdown format of the LGATs. But here is the absolute crucial difference. While Synanon and those LGATs were applied to consenting adults, CEDU applied this convergence to captive children, kids who had zero legal or practical means of just walking out the door. Section 2. The anatomy of the prophet and its destabilization cycle. Inside CEDU, they ran these intense workshops known as prophets, and the 24-hour prophet was, quite literally, an engineered destabilization cycle. That 24-hour duration, that wasn't arbitrary. It is the precise length of time needed to disable the human brain's capacity for resistance. Just look at the data here. Phase 1 runs from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. This is the setup, defenses are still up. But Phase 2 hits from 3 a.m. to 9 a.m. This is the deep breakdown. Cognitive slowing kicks in, and emotional volatility spikes under the attack therapy. Moving into Phase 3, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., we see the new identity construction. Impulse control is heavily compromised now, and suggestibility is off the charts. Finally, Phase 4, from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., microsleeps are happening. Reality testing completely fails. The environment dictates a sudden reframe to love and unity, which basically means whatever the room says becomes the subject's new truth. So what is the delivery mechanism for all of this? It's music. High-volume, repetitive music systematically bypassed the neocortex. It forced an emotional override and acted as a tool for classical conditioning. You know, in normal life, music might accompany a mood. But in a prophetist, music is imposed to install a mood, and it works through 4 specific mechanisms. First, it bypasses the reasoning neocortex to directly hit the limbic system. I mean, you literally cannot argue with a song, right? Second, prolonged repetition combined with that sleep deprivation induces a trance state. Third, the sheer volume triggers cortisol release, driving the body into an inevitable state of emotional flooding. And fourth, this repetition during extreme emotional arousal produces classical Pavlovian conditioning. The song actually becomes welded to engineered breakdown and shame deep inside the participant's nervous system. Section 3, Grof and the Clinical Roots, examining the psychiatric blueprint. To understand this, we have to look at Dr. Stanislav Grof. He was a pioneering psychiatric researcher who originally studied LSD's effects on the human mind. But when psychedelics were banned, he needed a non-pharmacological substitute, right? So he developed what's called holotropic breathwork. This clinical mechanism used sustained hyperventilation to reduce oxygen to the cortex, evocative music to drive emotional states, and focused body work. Holotropic breathwork provided the exact structural architecture for industrialized music-driven catharsis, completely without the use of drugs. Grof mapped these altered states into 4 basic perinatal matrices, or BPMs, which essentially mirror the stages of birth. BPM I is an oceanic state of unity. BPM 2 is the onset of contractions, basically hopelessness with zero exit. BPM 3 is the violent struggle and active push. And BPM 4 is the explosive release, liberation, and ego death rebirth. Now, here's where it gets crazy. The prophet's specific 4-stage emotional and musical arc structurally mirrors Grof's matrices perfectly. It opens with unity, drops into despair in the dead of night, forces violent breakdown, and ends with an explosive reframe into love. The exact same sequence was applied to induce ego collapse. These programs discovered empirically that if you create BPM 2 conditions, sleep-deprived, locked-in, depressing music playing, the subject will reliably move into BPM 3 and 4, resulting in an experience that feels incredibly profound. Section 4. Stripping the safeguards and the inversion of protections. While the underlying technology was identical, the application was dangerously inverted. Grof absolutely insisted on consent and support to make the procedure safe. He relied on the principles of set, setting, and integration. Set meant screening out vulnerable patients and preparing them. Setting meant a supportive, voluntary space where you could stop at any time. And integration meant extensive therapeutic follow-up to actually process what happened. CEDU, on the other hand, systematically stripped away every single safeguard. Set was inverted into the active destabilization of unscreened adolescents already in crisis. Setting became a locked room with coercive captivity. And clinical integration? Completely replaced by forced indoctrination and demanded loyalty to the program. And here is a critical fact we found in the research. Grof himself extensively documented the shadow side of his techniques. He explicitly warned what would happen if they were applied without safeguards to traumatized individuals. His predicted casualties included persistent dissociation, depersonalization, fragmentation of the sense of self, post-experience depression, and suicidality. Because CEDU applied this on captive, traumatized kids, they triggered the exact psychiatric failure modes that Grof himself explicitly warned about in print. The literal inventor of the clinical technology identified the exact population CEDU was targeting as the most likely to be severely damaged by these procedures. Section 5. Trauma and the aftermath, focusing on the physiological reality. This brings us to the very real physiological burden that survivors carry today. When survivors avoid CEDU music, it is not an emotional overreaction. It's called trauma cue reactivity. This is a neurological alarm response, where a stimulus, one that was heavily paired with engineered psychological harm, triggers physiological panic long after the event is over. A survivor's severe aversion to specific prophet music isn't them being oversensitive, it is a conditioned, medically documented nervous system response. It's identical to a veteran hearing fireworks, or Pavlov's dogs reacting to a bell. Their nervous system has correctly identified that song as a threat cue. Now, a lot of survivors carry a really deep, private confusion because they felt a real catharsis and a real sense of being remade during these prophets. But there's a quote from our research that hits the nail on the head and clarifies this perfectly. The realness of the experience does not validate the program. It validates the technology, which the program stole. And that distinction is everything. It lets survivors honor that their induced catharsis was biologically real, while recognizing the procedure itself was entirely coercive and abusive. The nervous system events were real, for sure, but they were the result of a powerful clinical technology deployed maliciously without an ounce of consent. So we've laid out the facts. We have established the chronological lineage, the clinical mechanics, and the deliberate removal of medical safeguards. The dossier clearly shows a systematic application of adult clinical conditioning on unconsenting youths, which leaves us with this final burning question. How did the regulatory environment allow clinical procedures explicitly known by their own inventors to cause severe psychiatric casualties, to operate on captive children for decades without any oversight?